Hello and welcome to Free Your Mind with Dr. Sheena Mason. The following is a Q&A session I did after a workshop in October 2021. As I've been looking to add a question and answer series to my channel, I thought what better way to kick this off than to start with some footage from actual sessions that I've done. In addition, I'm looking to do some live Q&As that might end up being for my Patreons only. So if you have more questions that are not answered by the series I'm putting for the public, then in the description box, join my patrons and you will get access to some exclusive content over there. If you are not subscribed, please hit the subscribe button and the notification bell, hit the like button, and comment. Help more people get access to this. Ultimately, these Q&As are in response to my Theory of Racelessness work. And so you'll hear a lot of the questions, people grappling with the different philosophies and just having more questions in terms of how could this look in society and when will we know that we will be successful. Without further ado, enjoy. Thank you all again so much for joining me today. I want to open up the floor to your questions, so um, I'm going to catch up. Also, I'm going to share in the chat box a link to a workshop I created for today that in a non-COVID world we would have been able to do this in person together. There's the link to the the worksheet if you want to check it out. We are going to talk about some of those questions, but let me just see if anyone has questions already that I can tend to. Dan, great question. I was just talking about the same question the other day. So, what demographic alternative categories to race are suggested for the US Census? If we do a historical analysis on the US Census, we would come to recognize that the census itself was at least in part devised and revised to maintain the status quo of this racialist division and to maintain the status quo of racism, which is often conflated with classism as it does point to a certain class system. So, translation, when we're answering on that census, which by the way, that's a mandatory thing now. The census used to be something most of us would avoid responding to, but now it's mandatory that you comply and respond. And when you answer the question of race on that form, and because they intentionally conflate the idea of race with ethnicity, where ethnicity is a real category, they basically make it the same and they say, which race or ethnicity are you? By filling out that information, it then enables them to determine which communities get funded and certain programs and which ones don't. And they've come to depend a lot on communities creating nonprofits to pull themselves up by the bootstraps in certain ways. And those communities tend to be racialized Black and Brown communities, um, because not all racialized Black and Brown people are poor, but we do tend to be disproportionately impoverished. And the census is a way to maintain that. So I don't have an exact answer to what a perfect census in a perfect non-racist world would look like, but I do know that the categories of ethnicity and race have no business being on those forms. Yes, Greta. Right. Right. They say there are two ethnicities, but in most other places, which are Hispanic or non-Hispanic, but in most other places, here's how they conflate race with ethnicity when they ask a question just about race, right? They'll say Black or African American. There is a case to be made that African American is an ethnicity, right? Uh, but African American has come to be conflated with black, being black and blackness. So there's this shifty way in which they combine ethnicity and race, um, to again uphold the idea of it and make it so that it's less feasible for more of us to disentangle. Tito, critical race theory. It's one of my current favorite topics. So listen, I anyone who knows me knows that I suffer from imposter syndrome. So I'm not grandstanding, but I do believe that I have the solution to critical race theory, the critical race theory problem that's happening, uh, because ultimately the reasons people give for being against critical race theory, if we listen to them, even if we don't feel like they're speaking from good intentions, which I have no reason to believe that they're not, but that argument is being made, what they're saying, and these are people who are racialized in all different ways, right, across the five categories, speaking out against what's being called critical race theory because they're saying you're teaching race to my children and thereby you're teaching racism, which I'm sure I've made it clear that that's exactly my position. Those people are actually right. By teaching race, we are teaching racism. We are allowing it, and enabling it to continue to persist. So, how do we get out of that? Well, we start teaching children, instead of teaching children that, and instead of teaching college students that, instead of teaching ourselves that, because it's never too late to unlearn some things, right, and learn new information, we learn the philosophies of race. We teach the philosophies of race. We work from a skeptical and eliminativist positionality. So when I'm in my classrooms, I'm also an assistant professor. When I'm in the classroom, the premise is that in this space, even if you leave my classroom and you know buy into social construction and all of that, in this classroom space for these few minutes, we are all raceless. You are not racialized in this classroom. You are not racialized in any way. And now from that position, let's examine the literature. Let's take a look at it. Let's come up with interpretations and analyses. And if we see racism at hand, if we see race in the text, one of my friends calls it the race translator. What is actually being communicated here? Is it actually something that would be better described outside of race language, like culture or ethnicity? Is it racism hiding its face? Is the language a metaphor for racism and empowerment and disempowerment, things like that? And I find that people, when given an opportunity to de-racialize themselves, to view themselves as raceless human beings, they are better able and empowered and equipped to have more meaningful conversations about the problem that does exist, such as racism, to interrogate and question everything, which I think is something that is lacking in today's society, at least if we pay attention to the loudest voices on social media. They actually come to question everything. Is this happening racist? Is it not racist? If it is racist, like how, why, who, what, where, when, and what's the solution? But outside of that, it also liberating oneself from racism also means liberating oneself from seeing other things in black and white ways, pun intended, like left versus right, conservative versus liberal, me versus you, us versus them. I find, and given the testimonials of my students and people I work with, this is a much more fruitful, generative way to go about talking about real problems, right? And but importantly, being part of the solution and helping people imagine solutions. And I talk about this in my forthcoming book. So I have a book being published by Palgrave Macmillan, um, early next year. And so I talk about this more extensively there, but also I'll share a link to my podcast at the end of this discussion where I spend more time talking about the same thing. Um, well, Greg, I see your question. For anyone who wants more information, or if you want a copy of the script for my presentation today, that's what Greg was asking for. Feel free to email me. There's my email. I'm happy to send you the script. I don't believe in hoarding knowledge or information. Yes, thank you, Amber. So that's one of my current strategies and intents is to, I'm working with a teacher from New York City who was fired for speaking out against the practices that were happening at his school. And we're doing everything we can to spread the word, to educate people. It's I don't think it's an accident that more people than not are unaware that there are alternative philosophies of race, and so we're trying to help people be aware and help people get more people more of what they actually want, right, which is an acknowledgement of the problem, but also not a perpetuation or an inversion of the problem. Elizabeth, it took me years to digest what I just said, so it's relatable. I'm happy to send the script if you email me. Yeah, so race, um the theory of racelessness applies to every person, um, at least in the American context. Part of my strategy too is to educate people on race and racism outside of the United States, because the here's the ironic part. In American society, we tend to take for granted the objective reality of race, and we apply it on a global scale. But if we actually did an analysis of other communities, or we actually spoke to people from other countries, we come to find that people from the continent of Africa, Nigerians, Ethiopians, Eritreans, Ghanaians, all kinds of people from Africa will tell you that they see themselves as raceless. If they apply the word black to themselves to describe themselves, it's simply a descriptor. It's a sort of matter of fact. It doesn't carry all of the weight that it carries in American society. And they don't see, therefore, they don't tend to see a sort of diasporic consciousness or anything like that we talk about in America and that we presume exists and we write it on to everyone else. They just see themselves very differently. And I had a conversation with somebody from Nigeria recently, and he was explaining to me that if I went to Nigeria, they would consider me a white woman. I asked him if it was because I have fair skin, right? It's a fair question. But he said no. Any person coming from across the ocean to get to Africa, they consider white. So Asian people fall into that category, Latinx people fall in that category, Americans, like we all fall into that category of white, which is was really interesting to hear actually. Then you also talk to some people from Jamaica and come to find that they don't racialize themselves in that way either. They take it as a neutral descriptor, a sort of matter of fact, like yes, I'm black, but they don't take it as like an integral part of their identity. It's just none of that happens. And then when they come to the United States, they get thrown into race ideology, American race ideology, and then they have to navigate and figure out how they're going to proceed. And sometimes they end up choosing race, right? Um, because they feel kind of forced to, they're subsumed into the society. Or there are people on YouTube like this young lady, her name is Desiree, and she speaks out against it. She says, it's not it's not who I am, it's not how I see myself, and I find it really problematic that people are forcing me into this category that I'm not choosing. No, so Elizabeth, great question. Thank you. So, y'all are asking very excellent questions. Thank you for your engagement. So, no, I would say we should not be focused on race, because if we're true to our word and wanting to actually solve and resolve the issue of racism, then by continuing to talk about it in the language of race means that we're continuing to uphold the category of race. And the reason why implicit bias trainings and things like that have been proven to be insufficient and ineffective is because ultimately, if we do implicit bias training and we focus on implicit bias training as connected to race and racism, what ends up happening is there's no change in how a person thinks about other people or thinks about themselves. We actually affirm how they think about themselves and how they think about other people, and then we traditionally try to help them just do better, right? Like it's almost like trying to impose a sort of color blindness ideology or mentality onto those folks. Again, very well intended, except for the fact that you're still upholding the idea of race. You're still upholding it as a valid category. You're still confirming it. Thereby, what comes with it is a hierarchy that's built into race. And then we're surprised that we're unable to get to transcend racism, is because we keep approaching it in this sort of way. So, a better approach from my own experience and expertise, and I have extensive business experience as well as I'm a Teach for America core member, and I work with 9th through 12th graders, and I teach college now. So I've done the whole gamut of work, and a better strategy is deracializing people, teaching them about alternative philosophies of race, just putting it on the table, encouraging them to look at themselves as raceless in that space, and then asking the types of questions that I put in that worksheet there, right? Like, what are the philosophies of race? As a sort of recap, who are you? Who are you outside of race? And what does any of who you are have to do with your so-called race? And really helping people ask these questions that they are otherwise very seldom asked. I can't tell you a time when I was asked who I am outside of race. It never happened. And so then the last thing I'll say, Elizabeth, too, because I want to make sure this is clear, by redirecting the focus away from race to racism, there's a way in which, if you empower people to view themselves as racist, there's a way in which we can have more meaningful conversations about how whiteness is created in society, how blackness is created in society, without putting people into those named categories. And ultimately, what people will come to see for themselves is, oh, actually, she's right. Racism creates race. Racism is race, because when we look at the category of race and we hear the language of race, it's almost always it we almost always can translate it into something else, something about racism, or we can translate it into something about ethnicity or nationality, even, or culture. And if that's the case, then race doesn't exist. And people, I can't even begin to tell you how many people have been found themselves to be truly liberated from race ideology, because it really does inspire a new outlook. It inspires healing and actual unification. It inspires people to see their similarities that exist between themselves and people they view as racially different and distinct. It allows people to see meaningful similarities. There's something about honoring and respecting differences, but when the differences are presumed based on race, which is a made up category, how is that actually washing over differences that exist for many of us in our imaginations, right? And when we help people outside of those boxes, when we help them outside of that quagmire, all of a sudden they're able to see differences that actually do exist among racialized groups, and they're able to see similarities, which that's the gold mine. That's something that I think is underemphasized or de-emphasized in DEI spaces, and in spaces generally speaking. We almost always want to harp on these so-called differences without regard for how the differences that are being presumed comes with the hierarchy, and might not even be an accurate assertion of who a person is. Oh, Amy, that's a really great question. So, Amy asked a question about how do we talk about disparate impacts or pursuit of equity or access if we aren't showing different outcomes of race to motivate policy change and social movements? So, this is a paradoxical thing actually that I found in my research and work. There are studies that show that policies that have universal language and application have been more effective in doing things like closing the income gap, the wealth gap. And one would think in a society that tends to be very obsessed with race and color, that to solve racism, then everything we do has to include or be about race, right? That would make logical sense. It made logical sense to me up until relatively recently. Um, and then I started doing more research and getting to a place of really and truly questioning everything and questioning what I thought was knowledge. And I came to find that I was wrong, and that the reason why the other reason why race ideology helps perpetuate racism is because it prevents us from seeing how racism matters most, if you will, or how it inflicts the most violence. And what I mean is, earlier I said that not all racialized Black people are poor. We are disproportionately poor. So if a policy is just focusing on race, to my mind, it's not actually doing anything to solve the problem of the systemic inequity, i.e., the disproportionate number of racialized Black people being poor in this country when we only make up 13% of the entire population. So it's ironic because we think that putting race into the stuff works, but there are studies that show that affirmative action, that's race based policy, right? It's supposed to be solving racism. Come to find out, if you do your own research, you'll see that it actually has benefited most people from middle and upper class communities, usually immigrants or first generation from immigrant families who have money, who are, for all intents and purposes, not they've not yet been negatively systemically impacted by racism in the American context. So the people that affirmative action was supposedly supposed to be helping, those people remain unhelped. So we have to. I say that to encourage people to do more research and look and see if there are alternatives, if maybe we have it wrong when it comes to how we solve this thing. But I will also say that the media would have us believe that we haven't made progress at all, that we've reverted, that we've gone backwards in a lot of ways. And again, it's one of those things that because we're so focused on race and all we talk about is race and we buy into it and we uphold it, few people actually go and do their own research about anything going on in the United States, and come to find out that some of the big ticket items, the problems that we can point to and say this is evidence of America's racism, we come if we do the research, we come to find out that it's not nearly as bad as the media would have us believe. But why does the media need us to believe it's worse than what it is? Primarily to keep us divided, to keep us buying into race. Kendra, this is where the race translator comes in. How does a skeptical eliminativist explain or conceptualize the concept of whiteness or white supremacy? Is it recognized? And if so, is it called something else? Yeah, it's called something else. It's called plainly racism. Um, there's a way in which, when I say racism masquerades as race, this is one example of it. There's a way in which whiteness has become to be a metaphor for having access to power, even if not having power. Um, and by extension, it's become a metaphor for being racist, for being privileged because of race. The list goes on. Now, if that's how whiteness has come to be understood, more people, I would hope, would come to recognize it as a solely pernicious categorization, because this doesn't actually speak to the humanity of the people racialized as white, just as it doesn't speak to the humanity of the people racialized as black or anything else. And so if the language we use to describe racism is coded in race, just imagine how that then translates into the continuation of racism. It keeps the hierarchy, and it does keep us divided. So I make the practice of talking about racism using the word racism. I say it an obnoxious amount. Okay, so um, for the rest of the questions here, some of them are overlapping with some of the responses I just did. But if you have other questions, or if you feel like I didn't get a chance to talk about your question, please feel free to email me. My email, I'll put it again in the chat box. Please feel free to email me. Truly, I'm all about the life of, being the change that I want to see in the world and sharing knowledge. And this is such a crucial problem and topic and area. And so I'm dedicated my life's work to this. So don't hesitate to reach out to me. Um, I want to give you time to reflect and answer a question again in the chat box, if you would be so kind as to do it in the chat box so I can see and other people can see your responses. Tell me which philosophies of race you see yourself subscribing to. So I'm going to put them in the chat box too, just in case. So it's naturalism, constructionism, or skepticism, and then reconstructionism, conservationism, and eliminativism. So just a reminder, each of us has two philosophical positions as it pertains to race. You'll tell me, are you a constructionist, reconstructionist? Are you skeptical, eliminativist? Let me know in the chat box and tell me why. Tell me why you hold those positions. Even, and if you're thinking about, if you're kind of surprised to learn about eliminativism or skepticism, and if you're thinking about, maybe I need to explore this more, let me know that too. I would love that feedback. Sure, Jason. So, naturalists believe that race is biological, even though it's been disproven for over a century. They're still naturalists. Constructionists believe that race is a social construction, kind of like how we talk about gender, that it may not be biological, but society has rendered it real in some ways. And skeptics believe that race doesn't exist as a social construction or of nature. And then reconstructionists argue, usually are constructionists, they argue that we should just keep trying to reconstruct race to do something else. Conservationists want to keep race. And eliminativists, such as myself, want to eliminate the concept of race. And Gabriella, I do want to acknowledge your question as folks are thinking through their responses. So how can we implement racelessness in schools when there are so many people who continue to believe we're already in a post-racism society? Love that. And reject the oppression people continue to experience. So, one thing that's really important to consider is the fact that we don't need every single person in society to agree on anything, because in any human society, you would never get every person to agree on any topic, much less this topic. So, we don't need every person to buy in. We just need the statistical majority. And if we take a look around, if we have conversations, like I'm overwhelmed at the feedback that people give me. Um, we are a lot closer to the statistical majority than one would think. It's just a matter of presenting people with the alternatives and teaching them about the alternatives and the history of the alternatives and how those voices have continued to be marginalized and excluded from conversation and from learning and teaching. And we can be the change factor to help people know about the alternatives, to think about them. And more often than not, the idea sells itself. And also part of the reason why people resist acknowledging racism is because they don't, not always, but often, they don't want to be called racist. And as I was saying earlier, there's a way in which racism masquerades as race. And so whiteness has come to be understood, presumed to be this racist, inferiority complex, all this slew of ideas attached to whiteness and then placed onto people, so-called white people. And then we wonder why some people have a hard time acknowledging the problem of racism. Theory of racelessness removes those barriers for more people than not. And people are able to see themselves and their own humanity and feel seen for their own humanity as well, which is, I think, what we all want. I guess it depends on the context, Dan. Nice. Yes, Elizabeth, thank you for putting how you saw yourself coming into this presentation versus where you might be exploring leaving the presentation. Awesome feedback. Thank you for that. Awesome. So before anyone gets kicked out, I'm not sure how this works. Let me share an additional resource with you. So this is a link to my podcast. This is another way for you to connect with me. I have conversations with all types of people around the world, all professions, um, and all countries. And we just have conversations about theory of racelessness and other topics eventually. But right now, the focus is on the problem of racism. So if you want to learn more, I hope to see you over there. Let me know if you do end up finding me and watching something. Make a comment. Let me know where you came from. And also, I hope to hear from some of you through email. I'm happy to send books. I have a PDF of Racecraft. If anyone is interested, I can send that to you for free. Um, it's a really transformative read. I don't think they took it as far as they could, but Theory of Racelessness takes it further. So there's that. And then one last thank you. Thank you for your participation and your engagement. I sincerely appreciate y'all. Together, we can accomplish anything. And I hope to hear from you. Thank you all. Be well. It is a lot to process. Bye, everyone. Thank you. PJ, my brain hurts on a regular basis, so I understand. Thank you all so much. Yes, yeah, that's awesome. Thank you. I'm a SUNY alum too. If you're still here, I went to SUNY Plattsburgh for undergrad, so I've gone 360 now.